There were 5 people in the room, but only 4 plates, and the man who noticed was about to change everything, or get himself killed. The plate was still warm when he saw it. A perfectly roasted hen, glistening and golden. Potatoes thick with gravy, steaming next to 2 slices of cornbread cut evenly across the table. A feast for a king, or at least for a family that had seen a good harvest. But there were only 4 plates, and 5 people. The girl, the youngest one, sat by the stove. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her dress was too short at the ankles, and her hair was tied back in a rough, tight knot. She didn't touch a thing. She didn't even raise her head. She just sat there, still as a statue, like someone who had learned that being ignored was safer than being seen. John Fletcher didn't say anything at first. He was a guest in this house, a rancher passing through, and it wasn't his place. He just watched. He took in the room, the plain walls with their cracked plaster, the windows that let in the evening chill, and the kind of suffocating quiet that comes from people who have mastered the art of hiding cruelty behind good manners. The father, a man named Harold Traz, chewed with his mouth open, talking loudly about rainfall and the threat of corn blight. The mother, Esther, passed the butter down to their 2 sons. The boys were both healthy, loud, and flushed with the kind of greedy appetite that only well-fed children have. But the girl by the stove didn't move. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and she was starving. But it wasn't just for food. That part was obvious. Her shoulders sloped forward in a way that spoke of carrying burdens far too heavy for a child. Her arms were thin as twigs, her knuckles red and raw from scrubbing floors that were not her own. But there was another kind of hunger in her, a quiet, hollow, endless hunger. The kind that comes from never being seen, from never being loved. John set his fork down on the plate with a soft click. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the tense silence. "Why isn't she eating too?" he asked, his voice low and even, cutting through Harold's story about a broken fence. The table went still. Harold blinked, his mouth half full of potato. Esther's hand froze mid-reach for the salt shaker. Her face tightened. "Oh, she already ate," Esther said quickly. Too quickly. Had her plate before we all sat down. She's a helper, that one. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't nod. She didn't even blink. It was as if she hadn't heard a thing. John leaned back in his chair, his tall frame seeming to fill the small kitchen. He crossed his arms loosely over his chest, but his gaze never moved from the little girl by the stove. He wasn't looking at the parents anymore. He was talking to her. "Is that true, sweetheart?" he asked her directly. His voice was softer now, gentle. "Did you eat?" Still, nothing. The girl remained a statue of obedience, but for just a fraction of a second, her eyes lifted from the floor and met his. It wasn't a look of defiance. It was a silent, desperate plea. A flash of terror and a flicker of something he hadn't expected to see. Hope. And it was enough. Harold cleared his throat, a rough, grating sound. "She's quiet, that one. Always been. Best to just let her be. Likes to help out around the house, that's all. Don't you, June?" June. So that was her name. The girl gave a small, jerky nod. It was a forced movement, a puppet's gesture, the kind of answer she knew how to give without bringing consequences down on her head. A cold, hard knot settled deep in John Fletcher's chest. He'd seen it too many times before, in too many forgotten corners of the world. Children who were turned into shadows in their own homes, daughters who were raised to be servants, trained for a life of quiet servitude before they could even read. He thought of his own wife, Ruth, long gone now. He thought of the 3 stillbirths they had buried in silence, under 3 small stones on the hill behind his ranch, graves too small for names, but big enough to hold all the dreams he'd ever had. He didn't touch the rest of his meal. The fine roast hen suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth. After dinner, just as her mother had said, June cleared the table without being asked. She moved with a quick, nervous energy, like someone who knew that hesitation brought yelling. The two boys disappeared out the back door, their laughter echoing in the yard. Esther followed them, her footsteps heavy, to tend to the evening wash. But John stayed in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, watching as June scrubbed plates that had never held food for her. Her small hands worked furiously in the soapy water. "Did you really eat earlier?" he asked again, his voice even softer this time, just a murmur between them. June didn't look up from the sink. "Yes, sir." It was a lie. He could hear it in the tremor of her voice. But it wasn't a lie of defiance. It was a lie of protection. A lie she had learned to tell to keep the peace, to survive another day in this house. "You got chores tomorrow?" he asked, trying a different path. "Yes, sir." "What kind?" "Feed the hens, chop the kindling, sweep the floors, then school." "You like school?" There was a pause, a hesitation so slight he might have missed it if he wasn't listening for it. Another lie was being built behind her eyes. "Yes, sir." He offered a small smile, but it was sad, and it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped forward, took a clean, dry plate from the drying rack, and began to wipe it with the towel folded at his side, as if helping her. June finally looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. No one had ever helped her before. "No girl should be this quiet," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Not unless she's afraid of what happens when she makes a sound." She said nothing. She just stared, her breath caught in her throat. He watched her for a moment longer, the gears turning in his mind. He saw the faint, faded bruise on her wrist, peeking out from the cuff of her worn sleeve. He saw the fear in her eyes, a fear so deep it had become a part of who she was. He set the plate down, turned, and walked outside into the cooling night air. He was supposed to sleep in the guest quarters, but they'd told him the room was full, even though he knew for a fact it was empty. He didn't mind. He preferred the barn anyway. The stars were out, bright and cold, and the air smelled of dry wheat and wood smoke. But sleep didn't come easy. He lay there on a bed of hay, listening to the sounds of the night, but his mind was back in that kitchen, with that little girl and her silent hunger. Around midnight, a sound stirred him from his thoughts. It was a whimper, soft, terrified, like a mouse caught in a trap behind a wall. He sat up, every muscle tense. He listened. It came again, a muffled sob, drifting through the cracks in the barn wall, coming from the main house. John pulled on his coat and his boots. He didn't make a sound as he crossed the yard and stepped onto the porch. The kitchen door had been left ajar, and there, just inside, crouched little June. She was all alone, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her eyes wet and wide open, staring at nothing. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there in the shadows of the doorway, a silent guardian, waiting. After a long, heavy minute, she finally noticed him. Her whole body flinched. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" he asked gently, stepping into the kitchen. I dropped the mug," she stammered, her bottom lip trembling uncontrollably. "One of Mama's good ones, her favorite one." John stepped further into the room and saw it. Broken pieces of porcelain near her feet, swept into a neat, desperate little pile. He crouched down slowly, getting on her level, making sure he didn't seem like a threat. "Did anyone see you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Did you get hurt?" She shook her head again. He nodded. "Then no harm done. It's just a mug." Her eyes, wide and swimming with tears, lifted to his. She looked at him with a profound uncertainty, as if he were speaking a language she had never heard before. Forgiveness. "You ever been to a proper ranch, June?" he asked suddenly, changing the subject. She blinked, confused by the question. "No, sir." "You like horses?" There was a hesitant pause and then a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, sir." "I've got 5 of them," he said. "One of them is about to foal. Could use a girl who's good at being quiet around a new mother." She didn't answer, but he saw her fingers twitch slightly, a flicker of interest in the darkness, John smiled again. It was still a soft, sad smile, but there was something else in it now. A plan. "I'm leaving in the morning," he said. "If I had my say about it, I'd take someone with me. Someone who looks after others more than she looks after herself. Someone who deserves a hell of a lot more than scraps and broken mugs." June looked up at him, her eyes wide with a desperate, impossible dream. For a second, he saw the light flare up, but then, just as quickly, it was gone, extinguished by a lifetime of fear. She looked down at the floor again. I can't," she whispered. "Why not?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He saw the answer in her silence, in the way she hugged her knees tighter to her chest. It was fear. It was obligation. And it was probably something much, much worse. He didn't push her. He simply stood up, walked to the stove where a pot of leftover stew was still warm, and ladled a generous portion into a fresh bowl. He set it down on the floor in front of her with a spoon. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the barn. By morning, she was gone from the kitchen. There was no sign of the bowl he had left for her, just a clean spot on the floor where it had been. At the breakfast table, Harold joked loudly about coyotes and the coming long winter. Esther asked John if he'd slept all right, a polite smile plastered on her face. The two boys argued over who got the biggest piece of bread. And June poured coffee in complete silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. But as she reached across the table to fill his cup, John saw it. The faintest, telltale trace of brown broth on the cuff of her sleeve. She had eaten. As he saddled his horse later that morning, ready to leave, June stood on the porch, watching him. Her eyes were fixed on him, a silent, unreadable message in their depths. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. But as he turned his horse to ride away, she took one small, hesitant step forward. Just one step. And in that moment, John Fletcher knew. It was enough. He rode away from that house, but he knew, deep in his bones, that he would be back. He just didn't realize how soon that would be. The sun rose slow that morning, brushing the frost-bitten hills with a light that looked much warmer than it felt. John Fletcher rode east, back toward the rugged canyonlands that guarded his ranch like a fortress of solemn, crooked fingers. A cloud of low, lazy dust followed his horse, but his mind wasn't on the trail. It was back in that dark, silent house. It was with June. He hadn't said goodbye, not properly, but maybe it was better that way. Sometimes words just made things harder, especially when it was a goodbye that never should have had to happen in the first place. He'd seen it before, in dusty towns where men drank their paychecks and their wives flinched too easily. He'd seen children who stood in corners for so long they learned how to vanish in plain sight. But June wasn't just unloved. She was being systematically erased. She was reduced to nothing more than service and silence, a cupbearer at a table where she should have been seated like any other child. And it wasn't just him who had noticed it. The old family dog, a tired mutt who usually kept to himself, had stayed close to her side all evening, as if he knew she needed a protector. Even animals could tell when a soul was hurting. Still, he had left. What else could he do? She wasn't his daughter. Not yet. He rode on for hours, the rhythm of his horse's hooves a steady beat against the silent land. But every empty field, every lonely stretch of road, seemed to echo with her voice. Or rather, what her voice could be if she ever felt safe enough to raise it above a whisper. He thought of the way she had looked at him, not with hope, but with a deep, profound suspicion. As if kindness was a foreign currency, a trick she had learned not to trust. That look stayed with him longer than he wanted it to. It burrowed deep into his conscience. His ranch came into view just past noon. It was a modest stretch of land, tucked between two sprawling canyons and a grove of cottonwood trees. The fence posts leaned with time, but they were still strong, still holding the line. His horses greeted him from the corral, snorting a welcome through the rails. He went through the motions. He unsaddled his horse, fed the stock, swept the barn, and even mended a gate that didn't really need mending, but none of it could fill the gnawing ache in his gut. By sundown, he was back on his porch, a mug of cold coffee in his hand, staring out at the vast, empty landscape. The house was too quiet. It had always been too quiet since Ruth passed away, but now the silence rang louder than ever before. It was a screaming silence. She would have loved June. Ruth had always wanted a daughter. After the third failed pregnancy, the doctor had told them it was impossible. They had stopped speaking of children altogether after that, not because the want for them disappeared, but because grief had taught them how to carry their silence better than they could carry their expectations. They had buried the tiny, hand-sewn baby clothes in a cedar chest up in the attic, and there they had remained, untouched, for years. He hadn't opened that chest since the day he buried Ruth. John took one long, bitter sip of his coffee, then stood up abruptly. He couldn't shake it. That little girl's silence, the bones in her thin arms, her quiet, terrified obedience. It just didn't sit right with him. It was a splinter under his skin. He had only been a guest in that house for a single night, but something had been stirred awake inside him, something old and aching, something that told him, in no uncertain terms, that this time he wasn't meant to just walk away. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch, watching the stars, the gears turning in his head. By the time the first light of dawn painted the sky, his mind was set. He arrived back at the Traz homestead 3 days later. There was fresh dust on his coat, sweat on his collar, and a cold, hard purpose in his chest. This time he didn't ride up to the barn. He tied his horse right by the front gate, and he didn't bother knocking. June was on the porch, sweeping, when she saw him. The broom faltered in her grip. Her eyes went wide, but she didn't speak. She didn't run. She just stood there, frozen. "Morning, June," he said, his voice even and calm. She blinked, then gave a single small nod. Her hands clenched tighter on the broomstick. Esther stepped out onto the porch behind her, a dish towel in her hand, her face a mask of suspicion. "Well now, this is a surprise. Did you forget something, Mr. Fletcher?" "I need to speak with your husband," John said, his eyes not leaving Esther's. "He's out in the west pasture, mending the fence." "I'll wait." He dismounted, hitched the reins to the post, and took a seat on the bottom porch step, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. June disappeared back inside the house without a word. Esther offered him a cup of coffee, her voice tight with false politeness. He refused. The silence stretched between them like an old, splintered fence, sagging under its own weight. It was tense, and it was telling. It was almost an hour before Harold returned. There was fresh dust on his boots and a fresh, ugly bruise on his knuckles. He squinted at John, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Something wrong with your horse, Fletcher?" "No." "You forget something here?" "No." Harold stepped up onto the porch, chewing on his bottom lip, his patience wearing thin. "Then what in God's name brings you back here?" John stood up slowly, rising to his full height. He looked Harold square in the eye. "I'd like to take June with me." Esther let out a choked, strangled sound. Harold just laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "You want to take her? What are you talking about?" "To my ranch," John said, his voice unwavering. "As my ward, my apprentice, whatever the law needs to call it to make it legal." "She's our daughter," Harold said slowly, his voice sharpening, the good old boy act dropping away to reveal the venom underneath. John didn't flinch. "Then maybe you should start treating her like one." That landed hard. Harold's face darkened. "She's cared for," Esther snapped from the doorway. "She eats, she sleeps, she has a roof over her head." "She serves," John interrupted, his voice like cold steel. "She cleans, she fetches, she scrubs your boots, and from the looks of it, she takes your beatings." Harold's jaw tensed. "Are you calling me a liar, Fletcher?" "I'm calling her a child," John shot back. "And I'm saying she deserves better." Silence. A thick, heavy silence hung in the air. Then Esther scoffed, A nasty, condescending sound. You want to take in a girl now? At your age? You're all alone out there. You've got no wife, no bloodline. What in the world makes you think you're fit to raise someone else's daughter? John didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned, stepped off the porch, and walked back to his horse. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up. "Got a letter here from Sheriff Miller," he said calmly. "Turns out he's already aware of your parenting methods. Says I can file for temporary guardianship if I get her consent and the court agrees it's in her best interest." Harold barked another laugh, but this one sounded hollow. "The sheriff don't have any say over what goes on inside my house." "He does," John said, his eyes narrowing. "When the town doctor's report matches what I saw with my own 2 eyes. Bruised wrists, half-healed welts on her back, malnourishment. It seems I'm not the first person to notice how you treat your own flesh and blood." That wiped the smile clean off Harold's face. Esther's face went pale. "I want to talk to her," John said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Alone." Esther shook her head vehemently. "She's not some prize you get to take home just because you decided to grow a conscience overnight." "She's not a prize," John replied, his voice low and dangerous now. "She's a little girl, and you're about 2 seconds away from having to explain yourselves to a judge." Harold, defeated, turned and shouted into the house. "June, get out here!" She came quickly, her eyes wide with fear, the broom long gone. Her hands were twisted together in front of her, her knuckles white. John stepped forward and crouched down, so they were at eye level. He ignored the parents standing behind him. He spoke only to her. "You remember what I asked you?" he said gently. "About the horses?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "You still want to come and see them?" A long, agonizing pause stretched out. Her eyes flickered toward her parents, then back to John. Then, in a voice so small it was barely a whisper, she said, "Yes." "Then come with me," he said. "I'll take care of you. I won't ask you to do more than a child should, and I will make damn sure that no one ever raises a hand to you again." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, a single resolute dip of her chin. Harold took a threatening step forward, his face turning a blotchy red. "You ain't taking her anywhere." John stood up slowly, calmly, but with a fire burning under his skin. "She is leaving with me. And if you want to try and stop us, you'll have to explain to Sheriff Miller why your own daughter flinches every single time you raise your voice. You'll have to explain why her back looks like it's been lashed with a belt." Esther looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Harold stood his ground, but he didn't move. He was a bully, and his bluff had just been called. John turned back to June and offered her his hand. She hesitated for only a second, then she took it. They rode back to his ranch under a wide, empty sky. June sat behind him on the saddle, her small arms looped tight around his waist, her head pressed into the solid warmth of his back. She didn't speak a single word the entire way, but he could feel her relax, inch by painful inch, as the miles widened between her and the only life she had ever known. That night, for the first time in her memory, she sat at a real kitchen table. She had her own plate, her own fork, and a tall cup of fresh milk. John didn't say much. He just sat across from her, watching her eat. Not like a maid, not like a servant, but like a child. He didn't tuck her in that night. He had made up the bed in the spare room, but she chose a small cot he had set up in the corner of the main room instead. She wrapped the quilt tight around herself and clutched a small, stuffed rabbit that Ruth had once sewn and never gotten the chance to give away. When he checked on her later, her hand was curled up beneath her chin, her lips slightly parted in the softest, most peaceful kind of sleep he had ever seen. John stepped out onto the porch and took a deep breath of the cool night air. He looked up at the endless blanket of stars. For the first time in years, he felt something shift in the very bones of the house. It wasn't just because someone else was living there now. It was because, for the first time in a long time, it finally felt full. He didn't know if he could be a father. He had buried that dream a long time ago, but he knew he could try. And sometimes that was more than enough. John didn't wake her at sunrise. He let the girl sleep. He was up with the first light, moving through his morning chores with a renewed sense of purpose. He fed the horses, checked the long fence lines, and chopped enough wood for the stove, all before the sky had fully shifted from a deep indigo to a soft, pale gold. June didn't stir until the scent of frying eggs and strong coffee made its way under her quilt. She emerged from her corner quietly, barefoot and small, her eyes still uncertain, but clearer than he had ever seen them before. He didn't look up right away when she entered the room. He didn't call attention to her hair, all mussed from a deep sleep, or the way she clutched the stuffed rabbit Ruth had sewn like it was a lifeline. He just placed a warm plate down on the table across from him and said, his voice gentle, "Eat while it's warm." She did, and in the quiet morning light, that was enough. They fell into a new rhythm faster than he had expected, a rhythm of quiet understanding. June didn't speak much at first, but she watched everything. She watched how he moved around the barn, his hands sure and steady. She watched how he fed the chickens with one hand while unlatching the coop with the other. She watched how he cleaned his tools after every single use and how he tested the gates twice, even when he was sure they were locked. She was learning the language of the land, and she was learning it through silence. He didn't try to fill that silence with useless chatter. He let her find her own voice in her own time. And then, slowly, the questions started. They began small. Do the chickens have names? Why do the horses chew on the wood rails? Why do you wear gloves even in the summer? Her voice was still thin, like sandpaper, but it held something it hadn't before. It held curiosity, not fear. He answered every single question, never once telling her to hush or be quiet. Not even when she stood before the fireplace one afternoon, pointed to the old dusty photograph of a woman on the mantel, and asked, "Who's that?" "That was Ruth," he said, his voice a little thicker than usual. They were shelling peas on the porch, the rhythmic pop of the pods filling the air. "She was your wife?" He nodded. "She's in heaven now," June said. It wasn't a question. "I believe so," he replied. Then she looked at him, her gaze direct and serious. "She wanted a girl, didn't she?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her little feet didn't quite reach the floorboards of the porch, and her knees swung gently back and forth beneath her chair. He nodded again, slower this time. "She would have braided my hair," June said softly, tugging at a loose strand near her ear. "I think she would have," John replied. And in that moment, something tight and hard in his chest finally gave way. Days passed, and then a week. Sheriff Miller stopped by mid-month to check in. It wasn't because of any complaint. It was because he'd heard talk in town. Loud, angry talk from Harold Traz, and he wanted to be sure that things hadn't soured out at the ranch. He found John out back splitting firewood, the back of his shirt dark with sweat. And he found June curled up in the shade of a large oak tree, engrossed in an old book about birds she had found in the house. "She all right?" the sheriff asked in a low voice as they stepped away from the girl. "She's safe," John replied, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "She's eating well, sleeping better. She doesn't jump at every shadow that moves anymore." The sheriff looked over his shoulder at the small girl, who had paused her reading to give them a polite little wave. He tipped his hat in her direction. "Seems good enough for me," he said. The law didn't ask for much when it came to orphans. Not in these parts. If you had a roof, food, a bed, and no history of violence, that was usually enough. The official paperwork would follow, but the real test was always in the child's eyes. And June's eyes no longer looked hollow. Later that evening, John found her up in the hayloft. She wasn't hiding. She was sitting like she belonged there, her legs dangling over the edge, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and purple. "What are you thinking about?" he asked as he climbed the ladder to join her. June tilted her head. Nothing. That's a lie, he said gently, sitting down beside her. Your face is all wrinkled up with thinking. She giggled. It was the first time he had ever heard her truly laugh. It wasn't a polite laugh, or a scared laugh. It was a bright, clear sound that seemed to fill the entire barn. I was thinking, she said, drawing her knees up to her chest, that maybe I could stay here. Forever. John didn't answer right away. He just sat beside her, the two of them staring out at the lowering sun. After a long, comfortable while, he said, I'd like that very much. But the world doesn't leave people alone just because they've found a little slice of peace. Trouble has a way of finding your door, no matter how far you are from town. It started with a letter. It was folded neatly, with no return address, just Mr. John Fletcher, written in a sharp black ink. Inside was a court summons. Harold and Esther Traz had filed a formal complaint through the regional court. The accusations were stark and ugly. Abduction, coercion. They were demanding the immediate return of their daughter. John read the letter 3 times, his jaw tight, a cold fury rising in his chest. Then he walked over to the stove, opened the grate, and burned it. But he didn't ignore it. He rode into town the very next day, leaving June with a trusted neighbor, a kind widow named Mrs. Gable. He met with the town clerk. He met with Sheriff Miller. He even met with Pastor Wesley. Everyone told him the same thing. Legally, the Traces didn't have a leg to stand on. The girl had chosen to leave. There was a doctor's record of abuse. There was a sworn affidavit from the sheriff himself. The judge would almost certainly side with John. Almost certainly. But if there was one thing John had learned in his long, hard life, it was that likely didn't mean certain. And some men, especially men like Harold Traz, didn't fight clean. Harold was a coward, but he was a stubborn coward. And stubborn cowards become incredibly dangerous when they've been publicly humiliated. So John started preparing, not for a fight, but for a storm. He reinforced the back door of the ranch house. He taught June how to hide in the deep root cellar if strangers ever came knocking when he was away. They practiced it like a game, timing how fast she could get down the ladder and bar the door from the inside. She even packed a small wooden box with her favorite book about birds, a warm blanket, and a jar of strawberry jam, just in case. Is it going to happen soon? She asked him one night, her voice small. John didn't pretend. He didn't lie to her. It might. Are you scared? He looked at her small, determined face, at her strong little hands clutching the box. Only of failing you, he said honestly. The first knock came 3 days later. He was in the kitchen, chopping onions for a stew, when it landed. 3 firm, arrogant raps on the front door. John wiped his hands on a rag, picked up the shotgun he now kept leaning against the wall, and stepped outside. Harold stood there. He was alone. No Esther, no lawman. Just him, and a smug, ugly grin on his face. You're not welcome here, Harold, John said flatly. Don't need to be, Harold replied, his eyes darting past John toward the house. She's my blood, and I'm taking her home where she belongs. John didn't step aside. She left because you made her feel like nothing. She left because you filled her head with foolish ideas. She left, John said, his voice dropping low. Because you beat her. That took the grin off Harold's face for a moment. But then he pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Court dates in 2 weeks, Fletcher. You better hope she says what you think she's going to say in front of the judge. Otherwise what? John's voice was dangerously quiet. Harold looked past him, toward the window where a curtain had just shifted gently. He knew June was watching. He smiled that ugly smile again. Otherwise, I'll bring someone with me next time who does a lot more than just write angry letters. And then he turned and walked away, whistling. That night, after June was asleep, John went up to the attic. He pulled the heavy cedar chest down from under the eaves. He opened it for the first time in years. The scent of cedar and old memories filled the air. Ruth's things. A hand-stitched baby blanket. A tiny dress that never got worn. Letters she had written to him back when they were young and still believed they would one day be parents. He brought the chest downstairs. He woke June, gently. One by one, he showed her each item. This, he said softly, holding up the tiny, faded dress, was going to be for our daughter. June ran her small fingers across the delicate, faded fabric. Her bottom lip began to tremble. She's got it now, John added, his voice thick with emotion. You. And just like that, her arms were around his waist. She hugged him with a fierce, desperate strength, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, as if she was afraid that if she let go, everything would fall away. You're my papa now, she whispered into his chest. His throat closed up. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. He just held her, this small, broken, beautiful child who had somehow pieced his own broken heart back together. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the air. But so was the fight. John Fletcher had weathered loss before. He had buried his dreams on a lonely hill. He had mourned for what might have been. But this child, this tiny, quiet miracle who had asked for nothing and had given him back everything, she was not going to be another thing he lost to the world's cruelty. Not without a battle. And this time, he wouldn't be digging a grave. He would be standing his ground. The days leading up to the court hearing passed like a slow fuse burning its way toward a keg of black powder. John had lived through blizzards, droughts, and cattle diseases, but nothing had ever settled heavier in his chest than the idea of handing June back to the people who had used her like a tool and treated her like a burden. He had faced down death more than once in his life, but this was different. This felt like standing between a flickering candle and a hurricane. June didn't ask many questions about the hearing. She never once said the names Harold or Esther aloud, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The light that had started to shine there was dimming again. Her steps around the house became quieter, more careful. He noticed that she had started packing her little wooden box again each night, leaving it by the door, just in case. That small act alone told John everything he needed to know about the depth of the damage that had been done to her long before she ever set foot on his porch. He tried to talk with her about it one evening, just after sunset, as they sat by the fire shelling corn. He didn't press her. He just asked gently if she was scared. June didn't answer at first. She kept her eyes on the cob of corn in her hands. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "If they make me go back, will you still think about me?" John's hand stopped moving. He set the cob down slowly on the table. He turned toward her and reached over, gently brushing a stray curl of hair behind her ear. "I'd think about you every single day," he said, his voice low and certain. "And every night, too." She didn't cry, but her bottom lip trembled. Then she leaned into him, not saying another word, and stayed curled against his side until the fire burned down to nothing but glowing embers. On the morning of the hearing, they rode into town in John's old wagon. June wore a simple blue dress that Ruth had sewn long ago, one that had stayed folded in the cedar chest for years until now. He'd had to let out the hem and add a simple sash to cinch the waist, but it fit her. She looked small, but she also looked strong. Her chin was lifted, even though he could see her hands trembling in her lap. People watched them as they arrived. John could feel their stares from the boardwalks and the saloons, their whispers following them like smoke. Everyone in town knew the story by now, or at least they thought they did. And like all gossip, the truth had been bent and twisted until it barely resembled the actual facts. Some said he'd stolen her. Others whispered that he was crazy, a lonely old man who'd lost his mind. But John didn't waste his time or his energy correcting rumors. He kept his focus on the courthouse steps and on the small child walking beside him. Inside, the courtroom was small and stuffy. The judge was a man named Peterson, a practical man known to be fair, but also quick to judgment. Papers shuffled. Voices murmured. Sheriff Miller gave his testimony first. He spoke plainly about the bruises he had seen on June, about her malnourished condition, and about how her parents hadn't even noticed she was gone for nearly a full day. Then came Harold. He stood up there, proud and loud, painting himself and Esther as loving, misunderstood parents. He said June had a wild streak and needed a firm hand. He claimed that John had poisoned the girl's mind with soft words and false promises of an easy life. It was all for show, a pathetic piece of theater. He even produced a note from a preacher in a neighboring town talking about the biblical importance of children obeying their parents. John could see that Judge Peterson wasn't moved. Finally, it was June's turn. The clerk called her name gently. He took her by the hand and led her to a large witness chair that dwarfed her small frame. Her feet didn't even reach the floor. Her fingers clutched the skirt of her blue dress so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Miss June," the judge said kindly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Do you understand why you're here today?" She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "And do you feel safe living with Mr. Fletcher?" She nodded again, more firmly this time. Then she spoke, her voice small but clear. "He's my papa." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Did he ever ask you to call him that, June?" She shook her head. "No, I just did, 'cause he is." A murmur went through the courtroom. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge leaned forward. "And do you want to go back and live with your birth parents, Harold and Esther Traz?" This was it, the moment everything hinged on. June's voice caught in her throat for a second. She took a deep breath. She looked straight at the judge, her gaze unwavering, and in a voice that was suddenly loud and clear and filled with a strength no one in that room expected, she said, "They don't want me. Not like he does." A stunned hush fell over the courtroom. Even Harold's lawyer seemed unsure of what to say next. The simple, brutal honesty of a child had cut through all the lies and legal maneuvering. Judge Peterson leaned back in his chair. He took off his glasses and sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Well," he said, picking up his gavel and tapping it lightly on the desk, "this court happens to believe that children know where they are loved, and I don't see any reason on God's green earth to deny Miss June her right to stay where she has chosen to be." The ruling came down like a sunbeam breaking through dark storm clouds. June didn't smile right away. She just blinked, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Then, her face broke into a radiant, tear-streaked smile, and she ran from the witness stand, straight into John's arms. He knelt down to meet her, wrapping her in a hug that said everything he couldn't put into words. It was over. They had won. But as they left the courthouse, John caught a glimpse of Harold Traz's face. It was contorted with a dark, venomous rage. And in that moment, John knew that while they may have won the battle in the courtroom, the war was far from over. Back at the ranch, peace returned like a gentle rain on dry, cracked land. June's laughter, which had been so rare before, now came easily, like water finally flowing after a long winter's thaw. She built little nests for the barn cats out of straw and old rags. She sang to the chickens while she collected their eggs. She had even started memorizing the names of every plant and wildflower that grew around the house. Ruth's old, neglected garden had never bloomed so brightly. Sometimes, John would catch her talking to the photograph of Ruth on the mantel. She would tell Ruth about her day, ask her if she liked the new dress she'd gotten or the pie she had helped John bake. He never stopped her. It felt right somehow. One evening, as they were walking through the field to gather kindling for the fire, June paused and looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. "You think she's happy I'm here?" she asked softly. John didn't need to ask who she meant. "I think," he said, his voice gentle, "that Ruth waited a very long time for you, June." June reached up and slipped her small hand into his. "I think I was waiting for you too, Papa." Trouble didn't come again for a while, but when it didn't bother knocking on the door. It came by shattering glass. It was near midnight when the crash woke them. The front window of the living room exploded inward. June screamed from her room. John was already out of bed, the shotgun in his hand, his feet hitting the cold floorboards running. He reached the main room just in time to see the orange flames licking their way up the curtains. Someone had thrown a bottle of kerosene, a lit rag stuffed in its neck. A firebomb. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the back of the couch and smothered the blaze, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke. June was sobbing in the corner, terrified. The fire was out in seconds, but the message was clear. Smoke curled up the walls, staining the plaster black. Outside in the distance, he heard the faint sound of hoofbeats thundering away into the night. The sheriff came at dawn. There were no prints to follow, no name to put to the crime. But John didn't need any proof. He knew Harold's particular brand of cowardice, the kind of man who couldn't stand to lose and who had to make sure everyone else paid the price for his humiliation. This wasn't just revenge. This was an attempt to murder them in their sleep. He boarded up the broken window and reinforced the doors with new locks. June didn't ask any questions. She just stayed close to his side for the next week, sleeping with Ruth's stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. But it didn't break them. It didn't end them. They had both survived worse. Weeks turned into months. Spring bloomed, and then the long, hot days of summer arrived. One warm July afternoon, June did something that caught John completely off guard. They were in town for supplies. She had saved up a few coins from selling eggs and some little handmade trinkets to Mrs. Gable. Outside the general store, she stopped and pointed at a shop window. "Can I get that?" she asked. It was a small, simple picture frame with a delicate gold-leafed edge, meant for a photograph. John frowned. "But we don't have a picture to put in it." June smiled, a wide, bright smile. "We could take one." And so they did. A traveling photographer set up his big, clumsy camera out behind the general store. The sun was high in the sky, the dust kicked up just right around their boots. June wore her best dress, the blue one. John stood beside her, tall and proud, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her small hand was tucked into his. The photographer ducked under the black cloth. "Hold still now!" Click. And the moment was frozen in time. A girl who once cowered under tables and in dark corners now stood tall and proud beside the man who had given her back her future. A man who had found his own future in her eyes. Later that evening, back at the ranch, June carefully placed the new photograph into the golden frame. She set it on the mantel, right beside the picture of Ruth. "Now there's 3 of us," she said softly. She looked up at John as the last rays of sun slid low behind the hills, painting the world in shades of orange and rose. "You know," she whispered, her voice full of a wisdom far beyond her years, "I think this is what family means." John wrapped a strong arm around her small shoulders, drawing her close. "It is now," he said, his voice thick. The lamp inside the house flickered on, a soft, warm glow in the falling dusk. And the light inside that house, the light in that little girl's heart, and the light in that old widower's soul, never went out again. By the time the first cool winds of September rolled across the plains, the ranch was fully, truly alive again. John found himself waking up earlier and working longer, not because he had to, but because every task now felt worthwhile. Every nail he hammered, every fence post he fixed, every bucket of feed he carried, he did with a mind full of a quiet, steady purpose. June had changed everything. In the way that only children can, she had filled the vast, echoing silence that Ruth had left behind. She hadn't replaced his late wife. She had simply reminded John that his life hadn't ended. It had only been paused. The mornings had turned brisk, and a golden light spilled across the land in soft, gentle waves. June had taken to waking with the sun, and she was usually already dressed and halfway through feeding the chickens by the time John came down the stairs. She would sing to the hens in the coop, her small voice carrying on the wind with something that sounded remarkably like joy. But not all ghosts stay buried forever. One afternoon, while they were loading bales of hay into the wagon, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. John noticed the glint of sunlight on a tin star before he recognized the man. It was Sheriff Elridge. He was riding slow, his hat pulled low over his brow, his posture stiff and formal. When he dismounted, he didn't smile. "John," he said quietly, giving a short nod. "Sheriff." The two men stepped aside, just out of earshot from where June was happily stacking bundles of dried herbs in the open bed of the wagon. "I didn't come out here to bring you bad news," Elridge began, but his grim face said otherwise. "Just thought you ought to know. Harold Traz is dead." John didn't answer at first. He just studied the sheriff's face, waiting for the part of the story that truly mattered. "He was drunk," Elridge continued after a pause. "Took a swing at the wrong man in Carter's saloon last night. Fella put him through the front window. He hit his head on the stone horse trough on the way down. Never got up." Still, John said nothing. He just watched and waited. Elridge cleared his throat. "Esther packed a bag and left town on the morning stage. No one's seen her since. Seems she didn't want to stick around for the funeral." John finally nodded, once. "I reckon I won't lose any sleep over either of them." "No, I don't suspect you will," the sheriff said. Then he tilted his head toward June. "But the girl, she should probably hear it from you." He turned, mounted his horse, and left without another word. That night, as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple and a dry wind rolled across the prairie grass, John sat beside June on the top step of the porch. She had her new sketchbook in her lap, and she was drawing the outline of a hawk they had seen circling over the pasture earlier that day. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her plainly that Harold had passed away, and that Esther had gone. He told her that no one would be coming for her now. Not ever again. She listened in complete silence. She didn't cry. She just stared off toward the dark horizon, her jaw set tight, as if she was testing how the news felt inside her. Whether it felt like freedom, or whether it felt like sorrow. "Is it bad that I don't feel nothing?" she asked finally, her voice a small whisper in the vast quiet. "No," John said, placing his large, calloused hand over her small one. "That's not bad at all." She nodded, and they sat there together in a comfortable, healing peace until the first stars blinked into view. With the ghosts of her past finally laid to rest, the future seemed to arrive faster than either of them expected. June started school in town that October. She was terrified at first, but John talked her through it, promising her that she wouldn't be alone. On her first day, she wore another dress that Ruth had once set aside for a daughter she never had. June's pigtails bounced as they walked into town together, her hand tucked safely into John's, her eyes darting around at the new world that was waiting to meet her. It wasn't always easy. The other children asked a lot of questions. Some of them were cruel. One girl snatched June's lunch pail and said, "My mama says you're the charity girl who lives with the gravedigger." June didn't cry. According to her teacher, Miss Albright, she just looked the girl square in the eye and said, "My papa is a rancher. He doesn't dig graves. He plants hope." John had never been prouder in his entire life. "She's a fighter, that one," the teacher had told him, a warm smile on her face. "Whatever she's been through, it didn't break her." "No," John had agreed, "it made her." The winter came harder than expected that year. Ice clawed at the window panes and snow drifted higher than the porch rails. But inside the little ranch house, the fire burned warm, and for the first time in a long time, laughter came easy. June made a snow angel so wide it took up half the backfield. She carved tiny wooden figurines for each of the barn cats and lined them up on the windowsill. Every night she asked John to read aloud from Ruth's old Bible, pointing at the verses with a wide-eyed wonder, asking questions so big they sometimes took John hours to answer. One night, long after she had drifted off to sleep, he sat by the hearth, staring into the glowing embers. He wondered how his life had turned so sharply, from what he thought was an ending to what was so clearly a new beginning. He still felt the ache in his chest sometimes, the sickness he tried his best to ignore, the days when a sharp pain gripped his bones harder than the winter frost ever could. But now he had a reason to keep fighting. A second opinion had come weeks earlier, in a sealed envelope from a doctor in the capital. The doctor's words were measured, but hopeful. The cancer, he said, was slow growing. It had not yet spread. With rest, a proper diet, and careful management, John could have years, maybe even more than that. He hadn't told June yet. He wanted to be sure. But something deep inside him, something bigger than fear and stronger than doubt, whispered that he wouldn't be leaving her alone anytime soon. Spring returned like a hymn that had been long forgotten. The ranch bloomed, the trees filled with birdsong, the fields turned a vibrant green, and June grew. She ran faster now. She spoke bolder. She asked questions that no one on earth could possibly answer. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She wasn't afraid of anything. On her 9th birthday, John gave her a small silver locket. It had Ruth's initials, RF, engraved on one side. On the other side, he had the jeweler engrave a JF. "It's yours now," he said. "Both names, both legacies." June held it tight to her chest, tears of joy shining in her eyes. Then she asked softly, "Can we add your initial too?" John smiled. "I reckon it's already there." One night in early June, after dinner, while the fireflies blinked in the tall grass and the wind smelled of honey and lilac, June leaned against a fence post and watched the sun set. John joined her, tired from a long day's work, but deeply content. "You ever think," she said, her voice thoughtful, "about how things could have gone different? Like if you hadn't stopped at our house that day, if you hadn't said anything at the dinner table." "I think about it every day," he admitted. "I think I'd still be sweeping floors and praying that someone would notice me." "And I think," John said, his voice quiet, "that I'd still be digging." June looked up at him, her eyes deep and wide with a knowing that was far beyond her years. "I think God saw both of us," she whispered, "even when we couldn't see ourselves." John turned toward her, the last sliver of the setting sun catching the side of her cheek. He nodded. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "I think he did." And in that perfect quiet moment, with the fields glowing gold and the world holding still just long enough, they both knew that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the very beginning of one. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are heroes and shadows all around us and we're here to tell their tales.